The Butterfly's Dream by Kerberos 314, Chapter 5, Three Simple Words. And with those three innocent words, the course of this story would be diverted. It is not for this one to say what would have happened to Naruto not act out that first line, whether it would have made a difference if he consciously chose to write in his scrawled katakana instead of his marginally better romaji, or if he decided to put it off another day, another week, a year. One might wonder if it was an inevitability that the two would become aware of the other's presence, and like any childhood innocence, that period of sheltered existence was predestined to end. Regardless, this is the story they chose, and the only one worth telling. However, this fact which you and I did not stop either of them from wondering the same myriad of possibilities. Naruto would spend the entire week afterwards debating the foolishness of his choice. Though he still could count on those out-of-body experiences, he could only see and feel, and was thus left to guess at her state of mind. This only served to increase the discrepancy between the two, as he now watched passively as she carried on with her daily life without the false notion that he had any control over events. Gone were the days of his refuge from reality, and sleep only brought more disturbance and anxiety. Had she even seen his message? Could she even see the message? Did she see and feel through their bond, or was it only one way? Or worse, what if it was all real, really just a dream, something concocted by his compromised mind to give him solace in his miserable life? But no matter how many times he suggested that possibility to himself, he couldn't be brought to truly believe it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she was an entirely different person, and to suggest otherwise was diminishing her existence. However, he was brought again to face his guilt that he had taken something precious from her, and could only hope that she wasn't weighed down by his guilt as well. And as he struggled over the loss of control in his mirrored life, so too did he lose control of what was happening around him. He had managed to scrape past the gaining exam by the skin of his teeth, but now gave little care to much else, not even noticing the strangeness of the exuberant man before him, nor the oddness of said man explaining why he wouldn't be their gaining instructor, how the job fell to another while he took on a youthful apprentice, strange and odd being relatively terms for him now, and nearly everything taking a back seat to his internal battle anyway. But he couldn't ignore the rather sharp shove which nearly toppled him over from his seated contemplation. "Oi, what was that for?" His usual response shot out of his mouth before he had a chance to think. "Sorry, geez." The girl held her hands up defensively. "But you weren't responding to me, and to tell the truth, I kind of forgot your name," she finished, rubbing her arm in embarrassment. "Well, what do you want?" He didn't really mean to sound curt, and probably should have taken into account that he didn't know her name either, and if the snippets he'd caught in between were anything to go by, they'd be working together for the foreseeable future. The girl huffed, folding her arms, and shot him a look of irritation which he took in stride. "I was just going to tell you that the meeting was over. I thought that you looked completely spaced out when Maito-san explained how he wouldn't be our team's instructor, and that we would be getting a replacement here tomorrow." She scoffed at his lost look. "I guess I was right to assume." "Right?" He blinked, trying to dredge up any of the conversation he'd managed to catch. The brunette heaved a relentless sigh, rolling her eyes and uncrossing her arms. "Well, I'm not actually that surprised you missed that. To be fair, Maito-san seemed a bit overzealous, and it was hard to catch on to what he was saying between all the talk about youth and youthfulness." He cringed as he did indeed catch snippets of that, and vowed to repress the memory. For Ruby's sake, he hoped she didn't have to suffer through that either. The thought about his other almost dragged him back into his internal congress, but the girl managed to intercept him before that happened, muttering something he later realized he wasn't meant to hear. "I'm sorry." She turned back to him with her face twisted into a sour expression, something Naruto immediately recognized, having adopted one very similar whenever he made a social fox pass. "I was just saying that it might have actually been nice to have a teacher like that, to counter the sourpuss on the team, she told him frankly, with little regret. That emotion fell to him as he realized that he'd been less than friendly with someone who might have actually been making an effort to get to know him. I'm sorry, he apologized slowly, head fixed at his feet. I've just been dealing with some stuff lately and got a lot on my mind. There, the girl blinked in surprise, but nodded to signal that she accepted his apology. She clasped her hands behind her back and sketched him a bow, showing off her two immaculate hair buns before she popped back up with a politely reserved smile. That's okay. If we're going to be teammates, we need to learn about one another. My name is Tenten. What's yours? Though her cheer seemed more forced than fake, it was the seemingly truthful ignorance to who he was which had Naruto staring back in wonderment before he realized he was being rude again. Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto. He stood up and dusted himself off before mimicking the short bow. She gave him another mute smile and said, It's nice to meet you, Naruto-san. I apologize for not catching your name earlier. That's all right. I guess no one really expected me to pass either, and so they weren't prepared for another graduate this year. He rubbed the back of his head in chagrin, hoping he didn't appear to be bragging. Still, the fact you managed to graduate this early anyway is an accomplishment. It seems I'm the only one on the team who's not a genius. Well, at least until we figure out who our new sensei is. Naruto frowned despite the fact that she seemed genuine with the compliment. I'm really not a genius. Tenten just shrugged and took a handful of tapping steps away from him. Well, maybe you're just the kind that Maito-san was talking about, a genius of hard work. Naruto appeared to be thinking about this, but didn't know if he truly believed it. He was constantly having to redraw the borders of what consisted his self these days. The talent could have just as easily been Ruby's. Anyway, he noticed she was making it a habit of grounding his thoughts in the present, and he almost didn't want to let her leave. Seeing as we've got an extra day, I'm going to go take care of a few things in preparation for the second exam tomorrow. I also promised to help the old man out in his shop today, so I'm going to get going. See you tomorrow. She waved at him, which he mirrored automatically, replaying the last few lines in his head. Second test. Don't forget, 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, she called as she bounced off across the rooftops. Committing that tidbit to memory, he once again allowed his mind to wander as his body slowly retracted its steps back to his dingy apartment. In no hurry for anything that awaited him there, walking helped him to think, and he found that he didn't become quite so stuck in logic when he was on the move. His body kept him on a straight but meandering path, passerby giving him plenty of space, and he ignored them like usual. He had taken a momentary break from his previous focus, and instead replayed what he could of what he'd missed in the last few hours. As he got to the point of his conversation with Tenten, it brought his mind to the matter of the other two unknowns on his team. What would his new sensei be like, and who was their mysterious third, who was evidently a genius? Somehow he couldn't shake the idea of that space being filled by Ruby. Naruto's fears were not unjustified, and for the next several days Ruby found herself subject to unparalleled amount of fear surrounding everyday events. She would see Naruto in every empty desk at school and every pane of glass where her reflection should have been. It was the blonde boy instead. It didn't even matter what it didn't even matter that she hardly had an idea what he looked like, the boy having not even a mirror to his name. The ghostly visage which haunted her waking hour was recognizable in the same way she knew herself every time she looked through his eyes, and what should have been a reliable refuge suddenly was not. Gone was the confidence she had when traipsing about the streets of Konagakure, and suddenly everything there seemed utterly foreign and wrenchingly frightening. For once, knowing the truth behind her nightly voyages, the harsh reality crossed over into her waking hours and contaminated her normal life. However, as anyone who has survived the dystopian period known as pubescence knows, the struggle is real for everyone, and despite these uncomfortable changes the young girl was now experiencing, the end result should be more be for the better. Like any amount of rigid training will tell her, there is pain and hardship in improving one's mind and body. It's just so often hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So while she was well within the darkest part of her journey thus far, it was hard for her to see that any good would come out of it. For what had been a thoroughly unflappable girl, personally borderlining on aloofness, now becoming a skittish rabbit, frightened at every bump in the road. Her new behavior did not go unnoticed by either teacher or parent, and rather than assuring them that Ruby was in fact a normal girl who would not treat Grimm like they were mere toys to be dismantled, the 180-degree turn that she took frightened them almost as much as it did her. But despite their best efforts, she adamantly refused to see a psychologist, for what if she really was crazy? She would no doubt have to give up on her dream to become huntress, and in the absence of her assuring dreams of the night, that was the only fixed concept she still possessed. She would simply have to start depending on herself. But where to start? First and foremost, a reply was in order. "What you writing?" She had just finished figuring out how to start, reassuring herself that he would be able to read the Roman characters as well as herself, and sounding out the spelling of his name, when in her concentration her sister managed to sneak up on her. "A letter," she answered simply, not bothering to hide the three words already down on the paper. This answer didn't do anything to assure her siblings' curiosity, however, for who wrote anything with pen and paper anymore when a scroll could send a message across the world within seconds? And furthermore, who did her sister have to write to? She asked as much, and there was no way for the rough blonde to make it inoffensive. Ruby bit her bottom lip in concentration, but couldn't get upset with her sister telling the truth. She had no friends, and so had no one to write to. "You're not writing to an imaginary friend, are you?" The blonde worried, laying a hand on the 13-year old, which was meant to be comforting, but made Ruby twitch at the contact. "No," again answering truthfully, "not exactly," which again did nothing to assuage her doting nature. "Why don't you try making friends with your classmates after all? They're right here." Hands spread wide over the blacktop to illustrate the gauge of teens several years older than her, milling about in loose flocks. "They all think I'm weird." She couldn't blame them. "Why don't you give them a chance to know you? Come on. I'll introduce you to some of my friends, and then you can work on making some of your own." Yang gently prodded her sister, seeing that the younger girl was less reluctant to be corralled into a social activity than before. Ruby couldn't find it in her to resist her sister any longer, haphazardly packing away her writing supplies into her puppy-themed backpack and being swept up under the boxer's arms, only uttering a weak protest under her breath. "But there's already someone who knows me." "Dear Naruto Uzumaki." This time, when they met together on the roof of the academy to meet the new Genin instructor, he was distracted by excitement rather than worry, elation delayed for his own accomplishment at passing the Genin exam ahead of his peers, and confirmation that he hadn't completely ruined things with her. She was at least willing to try and write him back. It didn't matter that she transposed his name to her standards, and it didn't even matter what else she would have written had she not been interrupted. The mere fact that she had gone through the trouble of acknowledging his existence was more than most of the village had done before. Should he try writing more? What should he write? Did she understand Japanese, her hiragana, as much as he understood Romaji? He admittedly had trouble reading his own chicken scratch, so maybe it was better he try and copy her bubbly squiggles again, and it would be safer in case anyone ever found his notes and tried to decipher them. "Oi, Blondie, care to participate sometime today?" Tintin shot him an exasperated look, which he interpreted to mean that she had already tried to stir him. The third team member scoffed arrogantly and wiped his luxurious head of hair away, clearly insinuating that he wasn't worth Naruto's attention. Naruto wasn't worth his. The Jonin simply continued to sit and stare disappointingly, white chocolate eyes boring uncomfortably into him despite the painted mask he wore. Sorry, what was the question?"
His two teammates groaned in different octaves, and he had the presence of mind to look embarrassed. We're doing introductions, name, likes and dislikes, dreams for the future, the old man uttered without inflection. What's the point of him telling us? He clearly didn't listen to anything we had to say. Besides, what will it do to inform each other of such trivial matters? The only thing that is required of a team is that they don't drag down the progress of the strongest member. From the way he spoke, Naruto knew that they had already elected himself for that precious position. I'm sorry. Naruto apologized sincerely with only the barest hints of annoyance, cutting off Tenten before she could come to his defense and drag her own name down with him. Apologize without assurances are meaningless. What's done is done. Naruto glared half-heartedly at the boy. What was it a boy? He had an exasperated hard time figuring things out like that after looking through the opposite gender's eyes for so long. While I agree with the words, I do not necessarily agree with the sentiment. Seeing as I am the one in charge here, I will decide when something is unnecessary. The plain looking Jonin nodded his head in the blonde's direction, but Neji is correct. Your apology will be accepted as long as you do not let yourself become distracted again. Such a mistake can be fatal in the line of duty, not only for yourself, but your teammates as well. Hi, Sensei. Naruto bowed his head, forcing aside his thoughts on Ruby and the letter for now. If she could see through his eyes as well as he could through hers, she would understand if he didn't write back right away. Right. Well, in truth, the instructions didn't take that much time, and the second exam won't last more than a couple of hours. So, why don't we take things from the top? It would give other people a chance to rethink their first introductions. The man shot one of his unamusing stares at the boy, whose name was apparently Neji. Though the mention of the second exam once again threatened to consume his entire attention, he resisted the urge to submit to either distraction. He focused his happy mood instead on the there and now, listening dutifully to his teammates' spiels this time around. They were mostly unamusing, and that was including their Jonin instructor, whose name was ostensibly Yamato, just Yamato. He could already tell that he and Neji were going to butt heads quite often. He just held out hope that Tenten moderator would be a good moderator for the two of them until they could work out their issues, and more importantly, until he could work out his own. He couldn't yet say if it was a good change in his life or a bad one. Probably wouldn't be able to until well after the second test, but it was a step out into the light, and that was what was most important right then. What would she write? After an extremely awkward lunch hour, being introduced to her sister's friends, and getting plenty of practice with what not to say, Ruby still had no idea what she was going to tell Naruto in her letter. It wasn't like she could ask for advice either, for no matter how natural the bond between them felt, she could infer quite easily that it was not considered normal to anyone else. She was relieved to go back to class where it was almost guaranteed that she would be left alone to complete the monotonous work in solitude. She would just wait for him to write her back as he had the first time, although considering he hadn't gotten much farther than her that first time around, perhaps she should be the one to take the next step. It was a day for firsts after all. But as she sat now in front of her desk in the comfort of her home, hand poised over the blank parchment, her eyes caught on the small moleskin notebook which was a constant fixture on that humble piece of furniture. Her diary. There had never been a need to hide the otherwise private information it contained. She hadn't had any secrets to keep from her father or sister. Well, until now, that is. But everything that could ever be said about her until that point had been written down in front of her eyes already, though she had yet to think about it under this context. If Naruto didn't know almost everything about her by then, no amount of her spilling her guts on the page would help them become acquainted. So she slid that doodle steam cover in front of her, crackling the well-worn spine and laying it out flat where the velvet ribbon marked the latest page. She began to write. Dear Naruto, and once again she stopped, almost losing the momentum she had gained, but she ground her teeth and vowed to press on, penning just three more words, but they were three more words that had never been laid out before, and she emphasized their importance with a thick line swiped underneath, smiling at her finished work like it was a masterpiece of genius. Who are you? End of chapter 5.